In October 1347, 12 Genoese trading ships docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. The ships had come from Caffa, a trading post on the Crimean Peninsula on the Black Sea. As harbor workers approached to unload cargo, they made a horrifying discovery. Most of the sailors were dead. Those still alive were desperately ill, covered in black boils that oozed blood and pus. They had fevers that burned their skin. They coughed blood. And they were dying. The harbor authorities ordered the ships out of port immediately. It was too late. Within days, people in Messina began falling ill with the same mysterious symptoms. Within weeks, corpses were piling up in the streets faster than they could be buried. Within months, half the city was dead. And the plague that those ships had carried from the east had begun its march across Europe. Over the next 5 years, the Black Death would kill between 75 and 200 million people worldwide. In Europe alone, somewhere between 30 and 50% of the entire population died. Perhaps 25 million people. Villages were completely wiped out. Cities became graveyards. The death toll was so catastrophic that it would take Europe 200 years to recover its pre-plague population. The Black Death was the worst pandemic in human history. And this is the story of how it happened. The plague didn't originate in Europe. It came from somewhere in Central Asia, probably the steppes near Lake Issyk-Kul in modern Kyrgyzstan. The bacterium that causes plague, Yersinia pestis, lives naturally in wild rodent populations in that region. It had probably been there for thousands of years. But in the 1300s, something changed. The bacteria mutated into a form far more deadly to humans. Around 1331, the plague appeared in China. It swept through the country, killing millions. Contemporary Chinese sources describe a pestilence that killed most of the population in some regions. The exact death toll in China is unknown, but estimates suggest it may have been comparable to Europe's losses. From China, the plague spread along trade routes. The Silk Road, that ancient network of trading paths connecting east and west, became a highway for death. Merchants, soldiers, and travelers carried the disease westward. By the early 1340s, it had reached India and Persia. By 1346, it arrived at the trading cities on the shores of the Black Sea. And that's where the Genoese merchants encountered it. Caffa was a Genoese trading colony in Crimea. In 1346, the city was under siege by the Mongol Golden Horde, led by a Khan named Yani Beg. The siege was going badly for the Mongols. Not because the Genoese were winning, but because plague had broken out in the Mongol army. Soldiers were dying by the thousands. According to some accounts, in an act of early biological warfare, Yani Beg ordered his men to catapult the plague-infected corpses over the city walls into Caffa. Whether this actually happened is debated by historians. But what's certain is that plague got inside the city. The Genoese fled, boarding their ships and sailing for home. They carried the plague with them. Those 12 ships that arrived in Messina in October 1347 brought death to Europe. And once the plague landed on European soil, it spread with terrifying speed. From Sicily, it jumped to the Italian mainland. Genoa, Pisa, Venice. By the end of 1347, the plague was ravaging northern Italy. Florence, one of the wealthiest and most sophisticated cities in Europe, would lose between half and 3/4 of its population. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio lived through the plague in Florence and wrote about it in his masterpiece, The Decameron. His descriptions are horrifying. He wrote of swellings, buboes, appearing in the groin or armpits, growing to the size of apples or eggs. These buboes turned black, which is where the plague got its name, the Black Death. The lumps would burst, expelling pus and blood. Boccaccio described how victims developed high fevers. They vomited blood. They suffered delirium. Most died within 2 to 7 days of showing symptoms. The mortality rate was between 60 and 90%. If you caught the plague, you were almost certainly going to die. And there was nothing medieval medicine could do to save you. From Italy, the plague spread in all directions. Ships carried it to ports across the Mediterranean. Marseilles in southern France was infected in late 1347. From there, it moved inland through France. By mid-1348, it had reached Paris, killing thousands. The French capital lost between 30 and 40% of its population. The plague reached Spain in 1348. It struck England the same year, arriving at the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset in June. By autumn, it had reached London. The English capital was devastated. Contemporary accounts describe corpses lying in the streets, homes abandoned, markets closed. Some estimates suggest London lost half its population. King Edward III of England's daughter, Princess Joan, died of plague in September 1348 while traveling to Spain to marry. Even royalty wasn't safe. Though the wealthy had slightly better survival rates than the poor, mainly because they could flee to countryside estates and isolate themselves, the plague killed across all social classes. From England and France, the plague spread north. Germany was struck in 1348 and 1349. Scandinavia, the Baltic states, Poland, Russia. By 1352, the plague had swept across virtually all of Europe from Sicily to Norway, from England to Russia. No region was entirely spared, though some areas suffered more than others. The symptoms were horrific. Bubonic plague, the most common form, caused those characteristic buboes, painful swellings of the lymph nodes in the groin, armpits, or neck. The swellings would turn black as tissue died. Victims suffered high fevers, chills, headaches, and extreme fatigue. Many developed dark blotches on their skin as blood vessels burst. The plague attacked the circulatory system, causing internal bleeding and tissue death. Some victims developed pneumonic plague, where the infection spread to the lungs. This form was especially deadly, with a mortality rate approaching 100%. Victims coughed blood and struggled to breathe. And pneumonic plague could spread directly from person to person through coughing, making it even more contagious than the bubonic form. A third form, septicemic plague, occurred when the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly. This was almost always fatal, killing victims sometimes within hours of symptoms appearing. The skin would turn black from gangrene, which is why the disease was called the Black Death. Medieval Europeans had no understanding of what caused the plague. They didn't know about bacteria. They didn't understand disease transmission. Their medical knowledge was based on the ancient Greek physician Galen's theory of the four humors. They believed disease was caused by bad air, miasmas, or by an imbalance of bodily fluids. Physicians recommended various treatments, all of them useless. Bloodletting, which only weakened patients further. Purging the bowels. Burning aromatic herbs to purify the air. Some doctors wore elaborate protective costumes with long-beaked masks filled with herbs and spices, thinking the smells would protect them. These plague doctor costumes have become iconic images of the Black Death, though they actually came into use during later plague outbreaks. The most common advice from doctors was to flee. Get away from infected areas as quickly as possible. Those who could afford it did exactly that. The wealthy abandoned cities for rural estates. But fleeing often just spread the plague to new areas. Without understanding how disease spread, medieval people couldn't take effective preventive measures. Some cities did try quarantining ships before allowing them to dock, a practice that eventually gave us the word quarantine. Venice instituted a 40-day waiting period for ships, quarantagiorni in Italian. But these measures were inconsistent and often ineffective. The social impact of the plague was devastating. Entire families were wiped out. Children were orphaned by the thousands. Communities collapsed. The death toll was so high that bodies couldn't be buried fast enough. Mass graves were dug, sometimes outside city walls, where corpses were dumped by the hundreds. In some places, bodies were simply left in the streets to rot. The economic system fell apart. Fields went unharvested because farmers were dead. Livestock died untended. Shops closed. Markets stopped functioning. Trade routes were disrupted. The carefully structured feudal economy of medieval Europe, built on a large population of peasant laborers working the land, couldn't function when half the workforce was gone. For the survivors, especially the lower classes, this created unexpected opportunities. With so many workers dead, labor became valuable. Peasants who'd been tied to the land as serfs suddenly had leverage. They could demand higher wages. They could leave oppressive lords and find better conditions elsewhere. The rigid social structure of feudalism began to crack. Landowners and nobles tried to prevent this. In England, Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and restrict workers' movement. But the law was impossible to enforce. The economic balance had shifted. This tension between workers demanding better conditions and elites trying to maintain the old order would eventually contribute to uprisings like the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. The psychological impact was perhaps even more profound than the economic one. Imagine living through the Black Death, watching your family members die horrible deaths, seeing corpses pile up in your street, knowing that you could be next. The trauma must have been unimaginable. Many people turned to religion, seeing the plague as God's punishment for humanity's sins. Some formed extremist religious movements. The flagellants were groups of people who traveled from town to town whipping themselves bloody in public displays of penance, believing their suffering would appease God and end the plague. The Catholic Church eventually condemned them as heretical. Others looked for scapegoats. In one of the darkest chapters of an already dark period, Jewish communities across Europe were blamed for the plague. Rumors spread that Jews had poisoned wells to cause the disease. These accusations were completely false. Jews were dying of plague at the same rates as Christians. But that didn't stop the violence. In 1348 and 1349, Jewish communities were massacred across Europe. In Strasbourg, 900 Jews were burned alive. In Mainz, the entire Jewish population was killed. At least 235 Jewish communities were persecuted or destroyed during the Black Death. Some were wiped out before the plague even reached their regions, killed by mobs trying to prevent the disease. The plague's impact on culture and art was profound. The experience of watching so many die so quickly changed how people thought about death. Medieval art before the plague tended to depict death as a peaceful transition, a passage to heaven. After the Black Death, art became darker. Images of skeletons, the dance of death, corpses. The Grim Reaper as we imagine it today, a skeletal figure with a scythe, emerged from this period. Literature changed too. Before the plague, medieval writing often dealt with chivalry, courtly love, religious devotion. After the plague, there was a new focus on mortality, on the fragility of life. Boccaccio's Decameron, written during the plague, is structured around people telling stories while hiding from death. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written a few decades after the plague, includes references to the devastation. The plague also affected the Church's authority. The Catholic Church was the dominant institution in medieval Europe, claiming authority over spiritual and often temporal matters. But during the Black Death, the Church couldn't help. Prayers didn't stop the plague. Saints didn't intervene. Clergy died at high rates, often higher than the general population because they administered last rites to the dying and thus were heavily exposed. Some priests abandoned their duties, fleeing plague-stricken areas. This damaged the Church's reputation and contributed to growing skepticism about Church authority that would eventually contribute to the Protestant Reformation. The Black Death planted seeds of doubt about medieval Christianity that would flower in the coming centuries. The plague also had an unexpected effect on education. So many clergy died that there was a shortage of priests. Universities and colleges were founded to train new clergy quickly. Cambridge and Oxford expanded. New universities were established across Europe. This proliferation of educational institutions, combined with the social upheaval of the plague, contributed to the intellectual flowering of the Renaissance. The first wave of the Black Death ended around 1352. But the plague didn't disappear. It returned in waves over the next several centuries. There were major outbreaks in the 1360s, 1370s, and repeatedly through the 1400s and 1500s. Each outbreak killed thousands more, though none matched the catastrophic mortality of the first pandemic. The Great Plague of London in 1665 killed perhaps 100,000 people, about 20% of the city's population. The plague remained endemic in parts of Europe until the early 1700s. Then it gradually faded, for reasons that aren't entirely clear. Better hygiene, changes in housing construction, perhaps changes in rat populations. By the mid-1700s, the plague was gone from Europe. But it wasn't gone from the world. In 1894, a third plague pandemic began in Yunnan, China. It spread to Hong Kong, then to India, where it killed over 12 million people between 1896 and 1920. This third pandemic spread globally, reaching ports on every continent. It was during this outbreak that scientists finally identified the bacterium that causes plague. In 1894, two bacteriologists working independently, Alexander Yersin of France and Kitasato Shibasaburo of Japan, isolated the plague bacillus. Yersin gets credit for the discovery. The bacterium is named Yersinia pestis in his honor. For the first time, humanity understood what had caused the Black Death 5.5 centuries earlier. Further research identified how the plague spreads, primarily through fleas that live on rats. When infected rats die, the fleas jump to new hosts, including humans. The fleas bite, injecting the bacteria into the bloodstream. The bacteria multiply rapidly, overwhelming the immune system. Without treatment, most victims die. Understanding the cause led to effective prevention and treatment. Modern sanitation and public health measures reduce rat populations and human exposure to fleas. Antibiotics, particularly streptomycin, can cure plague if administered early. Today, plague is rare and treatable. Between 1,000 and 3,000 cases occur worldwide each year, mostly in rural areas of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The mortality rate with modern treatment is around 10%. The plague still exists. Yersinia pestis still lives in wild rodent populations. But the conditions that allowed the Black Death to kill millions, dense populations with poor sanitation, widespread malnutrition, lack of medical knowledge, no longer exist in most of the world. A repeat of the 1347 pandemic is extremely unlikely. The legacy of the Black Death shaped the modern world in ways we're still discovering. The massive population loss broke the feudal system and contributed to the rise of capitalism. Labor shortages led to technological innovation as people looked for ways to do more work with fewer hands. The trauma of the plague influenced art, literature, and philosophy for centuries. The plague demonstrated humanity's vulnerability to disease. But it also showed our resilience. Europe recovered. The population rebounded. New social and economic systems emerged from the ruins of the old ones. The Renaissance, the Age of Exploration, the Reformation, all of these world-changing movements had roots in the post-plague world. Some historians argue the Black Death was a necessary evil that forced Europe out of medieval stagnation and into the modern era. That's probably too simplistic and certainly insensitive to the millions who died. But it's true that the world after the Black Death was fundamentally different from the world before it. The Black Death reminds us that pandemics aren't new. Humanity has faced disease catastrophes before and survived. When COVID-19 struck in 2020, historians immediately drew comparisons to 1347. Both were pandemics that spread along trade routes. Both caught populations unprepared. Both killed on massive scales, though nothing in modern times approaches the Black Death's death toll. The Black Death also reminds us of the importance of scientific knowledge. Medieval Europeans couldn't stop the plague because they didn't understand what caused it. They had no effective treatments because they didn't know what they were treating. Knowledge is the difference between helplessness and hope. Today, Yersinia pestis is no longer the existential threat it was in 1347. We understand it. We can treat it. We can prevent its spread. But the bacteria still exists, still kills people occasionally, still reminds us that diseases that devastated our ancestors are only dormant, not extinct. The Black Death killed perhaps 200 million people worldwide. It destroyed civilizations, ended empires, reshaped societies. It remains the deadliest pandemic in recorded history. And its legacy, both the trauma it inflicted and the changes it sparked, echoes through the centuries to the present day. The plague that arrived on those 12 ships in Messina in October 1347 changed human history forever.